Good evening. This evening we're going to be discussing a point in history which is not only important in the case of the First World War, but is also deeply important and quite personal for the people of France. And throughout in the nation's history, this is one of the most defining moments. And so I'm going to be approaching this with the utmost respect everything I can to make sure that I address this with the utmost respect. So what we're going to be discussing is what's known as the Battle of Verdun. And, pardon me, at the end of 1915, the Germans wanted to find a way to simply take the initiative in the West. The hopes of a quick and easy victory were long since gone. And Kaiser Wilhelm's chief of staff, von Falkenhayn, he had a different idea. His plan was to do what's called bleed France white. He wanted to attack and kill as many Frenchmen as possible. And the way he went about to do that was he wanted to attack the ancient French fort of Verdun. Now, the fort had no military significance. There was nothing strategic about where this fort was placed. However, what it did was the fort of Verdun, the city of Verdun rather, was of such deep importance to the French people, going back throughout history. Like that fort had been a part of the wars that have been fought between those countries for years. And another point was as the end of the Franco-Prussian War, where the Germans where they easily defeated the French. While the fort of Verdun did not surrender until after Paris had capitulated. So it was a great deal of French pride in that city. And they knew on the German side that if they threatened that city, the French would defend it no matter what. It was of such deep importance to them, of such a national pride. And so what von Falkenhayn decided to do was he arranged for an artillery bombardment of that town. He brought over 800 guns up. And what he planned to do was threaten the city, let the French fill the city with as many troops as possible, and simply try to obliterate as many as he could with artillery. And it came up against 1,000 German guns versus 800 French guns. And it said the bombardment became so intense. I mean, at one point it was 100,000 shells fell in the city per hour. That is how heavy the bombardment was. The French held regardless of that, because up until that point the German to French ratio losses were 3 Frenchmen to every 2 Germans. But Germany wanted to make it 5 to 1. That wasn't necessary. 5 to 2 rather. That's not necessarily what worked out, because by the way the battle went back and forth, it actually came down to a 1 to 1. And for every 10 men sent to the front in Verdun, 2 of which were buried completely alive under the exploding ground and everything around them. And it says 2 million shells fell for every square kilometer. In that area, the topsoil is completely gone. There is nothing left. And over a century later, the ground still cannot be farmed. And the forts of Dumont and Fort Vaux, I'm butchering it. Those were different forts in that area. They held for quite a while. Actually, Fort Dumont was taken out quite early. But one particular fort called Fort Vaux, it held for 2 months. They had munitions and they held a tenacious defense, but it was not measured out properly how much water they were going to need. And so by the time the men had to surrender, largely because they were dehydrated, about to die of thirst. And so finally they surrendered to the Germans, and as they were coming out of the fort, it was reported that when they were lining up, they saw the French troops fell out and they dove for a muddy puddle and began double-fisted drinking from that puddle. A puddle that was filled with filth and filled, quite frankly, with some dead bodies. They were that thirsty and that far dehydrated. Now, it was saying that in the Battle of Verdun, in the 1960s, they are still finding 1 corpse per week. That is how many people died in that battle. And the idea that it was going to be lopsided German victory. In the first part of the battle alone, in the first month, it was 88,000 French, I believe, died to 82,000 Germans. So that wasn't working out well. Plus, there was another problem for the Germans. They not only are they meeting a very determined French resistance, they weren't entirely united on the German side. You had von Falkenhayn, and then you had the Kaiser's son, who was successor to the throne, who was also commanding German ground forces in there. He wanted to take the city, and he wanted to take it for the sake of prestige. And I took Verdun, but von Falkenhayn didn't want the city taken. He purposely did not give the Kaiser's son the supplies he needed to take the city, and so he just wanted to keep shelling it. And so at that point, you had the French who were determined to hold it. French leader Henry Pétain said, quite frankly, to the French High Command, they shall not pass. They held and they fought tenaciously. And finally, in December of that year, after both sides lost well over a third of a million men apiece just in that battle alone, the Kaiser, after sacking von Falkenhayn, said to the next commander-in-chief, Paul von Hindenburg, that he wanted a smooth and easy retreat and withdrawal from Verdun. He didn't want to do that anymore. So the Battle of Verdun goes as a symbol of French resistance, of French determination, where no matter what happened, they would not back down, where they would not retreat. They fought to the end. They held and they defended. It is impossible to understand modern France without understanding the Battle of Verdun. and those are some of the thoughts that we have on that. And thank you. Have a good day.